So, in fact, we can see that here we're seeing just one part of this picture, that emerging markets began to accumulate huge amounts of reserves during the last decade, right? So from 2002, 2007, we can see how these countries were really accumulating huge amounts of reserves, and most of it was in the dollar. And in 2008, you can see it was even getting bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? So this is a very, very important part of the story, and I want you to remember this because when we begin to...
I have a question regarding the previous slide.
Sure.
Does it mean that those countries which had a surplus invested mostly in US traded? No, the next one. Does it mean that these countries which had surplus invested mostly in the securities and not in a real sector? Because as far as I know, corporate taxes are relatively high in the United States, and they traded the securities. That's it, right? And this code to the
most of these were in financial assets and not in real assets. That's right, yeah.
CMOs and all the derivatives. Okay, thank you.
Well, a lot of the money was actually not necessarily going into things like CMOs or CDOs, which is just a word for securities that are issued that are backed by things like subprime mortgages. A lot of it was going into US government debt. But because of that, it helped to keep interest rates very, very low, right? So one of the things that the Fed discovered in its studies is that interest rates on US government debt and as a result on other securities that are sold in financial markets in the United States would have been much higher without these inflows of foreign capital.
So the primary sources of the investment were the treasury bonds of the United States.
That's where a lot of the money went, but not all.
The equity market as well.
The equity market, not quite as much. It was more in bonds and in public debt.
So it increased the...
I'm going crazy with this clicker, I'm sorry.
So all these investments, if I understand you correctly, that mostly all these investments increased this junk bond market, which was used for different types of acquisitions and so on. So,
not so much in the past decade. You did see mergers and acquisitions in the past decade in the U.S., but that's not the biggest part of the story. A lot of the highest growth that we see in kind of a class of securities in the past decade was specifically in collateralized debt obligations, and not so much in junk bonds. And those investments were not necessarily geared towards financing, in the form of like leverage buyouts that we saw in the 1990s, for instance. Okay, so as this crisis hit, driven again partly by the factors that we just talked about, one of the things that people began to talk about immediately is that there had to be some sort of coordination of macroeconomic policies to try to resolve the emerging difficulties, right? And I just wanted to start off by saying, historically, this kind of coordination of macroeconomic policies has been highly problematic, right? And the reason behind this is that generally countries try to get others to adjust so that they don't have to make the adjustment, right? So the kind of classic divide that we've seen over the last 3 decades has been, can really be exemplified by the US and Germany, right? So the US has consistently been running budget deficits. It's not been saving enough. As we saw before, we've seen growing current account deficits, etc. On the other hand, Germany has been running surpluses. It's been using exports in part to grow rapidly. So when these countries have gotten together to try to resolve these sorts of problems, right, Germany has said to the United States, okay, you have to increase your savings, you have to consume less, and you have to get rid of your budget deficit. And the US has said to Germany, well, you need to grow your domestic markets more, you have to expand your economy more, and that's going to solve the problem. So the US waits for Germany to adjust, so it doesn't have to, because if Germany adjusts, then the world will be a little bit better off, but the US can continue to take advantage of that. And Germany waits for the United States to adjust. So there have been efforts to try to do this formally. Many of you have probably heard of the Plaza Accord or the Louvre Accords. Those were in the mid-1980s. They had some immediate success in that they were able to, for instance, reduce the value of the dollar, which was grossly overvalued at the time. But within a few months, those accords completely failed. You know, the US promised to do this, it didn't do anything. Japan promised to do this, it didn't do anything. Germany promised to do this, and it didn't do anything. Again, they were hoping that the other parties would adjust so that they wouldn't have to. So it was a bit of a surprise to everybody when the crisis hit that we saw a lot of coordination taking place right away. So in the fall of 2008, we saw for the first time ever central banks around the world cutting their interest rates, not just within a month of each other, but on the same day. Right? You saw central banks providing credit to each other in the form of currency swaps. You saw an agreement to provide fiscal stimulus for 2009 and 2010 in an effort to try to boost demand and to try to help these economies to begin to grow as the crisis was deepening. You saw in 2009 countries getting together and pledging $1.1 trillion to the IMF to provide money to emerging markets that might be running into problems. So this was really unprecedented. And the only reason that this really happened was because the crisis was so severe and it was so sudden that policymakers were really frightened. For once, they were able to put aside their differences. They were able to put aside this, I hope that you adjust so I don't have to, at least momentarily, to try to get things going again. But as it turns out, doing the monetary policies was pretty easy, right? Central bankers talked to one another. They all basically went to the same universities. They go to Basel, Switzerland, where they have, the Bank for International Settlements, and they hang around and talk the way central bankers do. Really boring stuff, by the way. I don't recommend going to any of the meetings. So that worked out pretty well. But when it came to fiscal policies, it wasn't that easy, right? So countries promised to put in place some pretty big fiscal stimulus packages, but when you look at what actually was implemented, only the US, China, Spain, and I don't ask me why Saudi Arabia is here, but Saudi Arabia put in place large stimulus packages. The other countries in the world, a few put in place modest stimulus plans, but most of them put in place very small stimulus plans. And the reason for that is that, you want me to hold that?
Or I will
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Don't worry, I'm not going to do karaoke. Is that with fiscal policies, this sort of trying to get others to do more is especially prevalent, right? So fiscal, if you can get countries to do a coordinated early fiscal stimulus, it will do a lot of good. But if you get one country to do an early fiscal stimulus and you can wait, it does you a lot of good, right? Because that extra spending, that increased demand will provide a stimulus to your economy, but yet you don't have to go through the political difficulties of increasing government spending, having a bigger deficit, whatever. So I think for that reason, we didn't really see this kind of coordinated fiscal response on a big scale that everybody was hoping for.